Yeah, I mean, I think it's incredibly inspiring to work in ophthalmology because of the clinical unmet need. And we're focused at Gemini on dry age-related macular degeneration, and that's a subset of the disease that has, no approved therapeutics besides, vitamin supplementation. The realization that there are all these patients out there who have, no therapeutic options is an incredible need. It's a very inspiring need, and I think it's always really inspiring for a company to focus on subpopulations where there's nothing therapeutically available, where you can make a huge difference, where you can actually move from a situation where there's potentially nothing out there that can slow the rate of progression of the disease to a situation where hopefully you can have a safe and effective therapeutic that is a really viable therapeutic option that opens up that whole treatment area in a way that really hasn't been done before. And I think that's incredibly inspiring. That's why we have 3 different programs targeting 3 different genetically defined subpopulations within the dry AMD field. And we think creating separate options for separate subpopulations is probably the most direct and highest probability of success kind of approach in a disease as heterogeneous as dry AMD. I think it's an incredibly, important mission. I think, everyone values their vision, quite highly. One of your key senses that, matters to people, and I think, we're really driven by the opportunity to help patients and prevent vision loss. It's something that really inspires us. It's something that everybody connects to. I think that's one of the amazing things about working in dry AMD. When you talk about working in dry AMD, everybody knows somebody with dry AMD, regardless of where they come from, whether they're a vendor or a partner or a new employee, regardless of where they come from, it really is a disease that touches everybody. And I think that's extremely motivating to work on a disease where you can really see the tangible impact of the disease, and the mission to actually help people is very tangible as well. Yeah, I think we're really driven at Gemini for focus on really helping patients and really focus on helping patients at particularly high risk. So what I talked about this morning at the presentation that I gave at the main session was we're focused on very high risk genetically defined patient populations within dry AMD. And these are patients who lose vision early in their life. They lose vision anecdotally, often around the time that they're having grandkids, right? So they lose the ability to see their grandkids' faces, and that's quite impactful in terms of their quality of life. So we're really motivated to help those kinds of patients, and we, by looking deeply at the genetics, what we realized was there actually are distinct genetically defined subpopulations within this broad umbrella of dry age-related macular degeneration, and targeting those patients specifically could be a very effective strategy for actually helping them, but also it allows more targeted therapies in general and hopefully better outcomes. Yeah, so we've done a lot in a very short period of time, actually. So I think we talked on the podcast actually in October of 2017, and we had a good conversation, I remember then. Since that point, we actually have moved a total of 3 different preclinical candidates into development. So that's quite a deep pipeline, actually. The pipeline is broader than that, actually, when you include all of our research candidates. So we've got recombinant proteins, gene therapies, and monoclonal antibodies within the pipeline. What I also announced earlier today at the session was the fact that we're initiating a really exciting prospective longitudinal natural history study focused on genetically defined dry AMD. And it's actually the largest study of that sort that's been conducted so far. And I talked a little bit about the scope of that study, which is quite a big effort, including screening thousands of people by genotype and then stratifying those patients into different cohorts. And we're actually following hundreds of people over a period of a couple of years. And the goal there is to really understand the phenotype of these patients, understand the clinical progression of these patients, and we're actually assessing them on a whole battery of tests, including phenotypic tests, structure and function, and also genotypic tests, really looking very deeply into the genetics behind these patients. We're doing targeted sequencing on them, and overall really trying to get a very fine-grained and rich picture of how their disease progresses. So we're doing a lot of preparatory work on the natural history side in order to help us design and refine interventional studies in the future. There's a lot of innovation happening in ophthalmology. I think the emergence of gene therapy as a field has been something that's been really inspiring to watch. I've been in the gene therapy field for a while. Even before we started Gemini, I was working on a CNS-directed gene therapy company. It's been amazing to watch the field evolve, and the new approval of Luxturna and all of the work in the clinic right now. Some of it was presented today, really around gene therapy in the eye, and that's really a transformative event, I think. And ophthalmology in the eye as an organ is a really good way to do gene therapy and a good target for gene therapy. So I think that's really exciting. I think we see the emergence of precision medicine in ophthalmology as a huge unmet need. And a huge opportunity, actually. One of the things that we realized building Gemini in the early days was that AMD is an incredibly heterogeneous disease. There are a lot of different environmental risk factors, genetic risk factors behind it, but overall, when you look at the overall burden of genetics, looking at going back to the roots of genetic studies, twin studies and things like that, the majority of the attributable risk of actually developing advanced AMD is linked to genetics, linked to heritability. And the opportunity to actually go into clinical studies with genetically defined patient populations using genetics as an enrollment criteria is actually something that we are doing, and something that hasn't really been done in that field in the same way. So we see that as a really interesting opportunity. The idea of going after genetically defined subpopulations is something that's been pursued very successfully if you look across oncology and rare disease, and we think can be applied in a similar way to AMD and really make a major difference for patients. I think the idea of being patient-focused is incredibly important. We talk about that at Gemini quite a bit. So what that means is if you're really dedicated to the patient, for example, in the context of our precision therapeutics programs for dry AMD, what that means is you really want to come up with the best possible therapeutic for them. And that's part of the reason we are working on so many different modalities at Gemini. We have monoclonal antibodies, we have recombinant proteins, we have gene therapies within the pipeline. And the motivation behind that is, if you are truly committed to helping these very high-risk patients, you're willing to assess and evaluate multiple technologies in order to choose the best one and the best combination, actually, of different modalities to really help them. And that's a sign of commitment, I think. Another sign of commitment is really understanding the patients in a lot of detail and understanding them before you're actually treating them with a therapeutic. And that's part of the reason we are running natural history studies. We're sequencing patients. We're really trying to understand, even before a therapeutic is available, what is their clinical progression? How does their disease actually change? What is the variability in their disease? So I think those are a couple of examples of being really committed to patients, both understanding them and coming up with the best possible therapeutics for them. And that's what I mean by being patient-focused. And I think it's a really powerful concept. I think that really should be what motivates everybody in this field. In the ophthalmology programs that we're pursuing right now, and we've got both efforts in ophthalmology and also systemically, actually. But if we speak about ophthalmology for a second, we are really trying to be extremely rigorous about applying precision medicine concepts. And what that means is we're looking at risk variants linked to disease that are very significant. So it's not a minor risk, it's a significant risk. And we're also trying to be super rigorous around understanding the impact of those variants. So it's not just an association, it's actually backed up by functional studies. So a risk variant is associated with overall the probability of getting a more severe form of the disease, but also it's a risk variant that impacts function of a protein that has a biological consequence linked to the disease. So we think it's super important to back up genetics with biology and back up biology with the therapeutic modality. So I talked a little bit this morning about kind of a one-to-one correlation between what the impact of the genetic variant is and what the mechanism of action of the therapeutic is. And we think it's really important to develop therapeutics that directly compensate for an effect of a variant, a genetic variant in a patient. One example that I talked about this morning was our complement factor H program, where patients have loss of function mutations in factor H, and that results in a lower amount of functional protein in the eyes of these patients. And one of the approaches that I talked about this morning was our protein replacement product, where we're actually elevating the level of normal protein in these patients' eyes. So patients have lower levels of functional protein, and we're adding in more functional protein. It's a very direct kind of rationale. And we're able to create therapeutic approaches like that because we are being very targeted in the way that we identify patients and the way that we select them. And we think that's a really important approach, especially in disease as large and complex and heterogeneous as AMD is often thought to be. The OIS meeting is a fantastic forum for getting to have exposure to a lot of different stakeholders. You know, it's great to see, you know, physicians and investors and people from pharma all together in a single room, a big room, a growing room, it seems. And it is a kind of unique opportunity to bring all of those stakeholders in one setting. And it allows you to be far more efficient in your messaging, but also it's a really kind of inspiring and really kind of good networking opportunity to go from one conversation to another, and all the hallway conversations outside have been really interesting throughout the hotel, actually, multiple floors.